In the other life, I was your twin brother, and you took everything from me out of envy." These words came out of my 8-year-old son's mouth with the serenity of someone talking about time. But when he stared at me with those glassy eyes, as if seeing something beyond me, something I hadn't even known existed, my entire body shivered. It was as if time had stopped in the room and the air became too dense to breathe. For an instant, I felt he wasn't just my son. He was a mirror of something ancient, ancestral. The phrase rang in my head as he went back to playing, as if nothing had happened, but I remained motionless on the couch, trying to understand if it was a childish reverie or a whisper from the soul. The way he said he took everything out of envy stung like a wound I hadn't known existed. I watched him silently, searching for traces of another life in that delicate brown skin. Everything seemed the same, and at the same time utterly strange. In the days that followed, the scene replayed in my mind like a distant echo from another reality. I began to notice little things. He looked at me differently, as if testing me. And sometimes he said things that didn't befit his age, like, "This time you're the mother, not the brother." It was as if we were trapped in a cycle that even logic couldn't explain. The word reincarnation began to take shape between the lines of my anguish, even though I tried to resist it. My name is Hazel Nelson. I'm 39 years old. I work as a banker in Atlanta, Georgia, and until that afternoon, I thought my life was completely ordinary. Work, home, motherhood, solitude, a familiar, safe routine. I'd never sought spiritual answers, never read about reincarnation. But all it took was my son touching something invisible for my world to come crashing down inside me, as if he'd pulled back a curtain protecting memories I'd never experienced, or thought I'd never experienced. That night, I dreamed of a field of flowers, 2 children running side by side, a cry of pain, and a sense of profound loss. I woke up crying, without knowing why. It was as if my ancestral memory had been activated without my consent. There were faces I didn't recognize, but I felt them. I woke with my heart racing, my hands trembling, and the strange certainty that this wasn't just a dream. It was a calling. My soul whispered things my mind didn't yet want to hear. It was as if a voice inside me said, "Pay attention, this isn't a coincidence." But at the same time, it all seemed too absurd to be real. I stayed silent all day, observing my son with new eyes. He hugged me as always, but I felt something different, as if behind that embrace lay another story, another intention, another time. The following week, he said he'd dreamed about me. "You had the same face, only you were a boy. And so did I. We were twins. But you were angry with me." He spoke with the innocence of a child and the precision of an old man. My body shivered from head to toe. How could he know such things? The silence held secrets I couldn't decipher, and it began to consume me. I began discreetly researching accounts of children remembering past lives. I came across stories of reincarnation, documented cases, phrases spoken by little ones who seemed to have lived centuries. It was fascinating and frightening. Why my son? Why me? The feeling was that there was a cosmic plan behind it all, and that nothing was coincidence. But I wasn't ready to accept it yet. The questions came in waves. What did I do in the other life? He accuses me of envy. But why? Was I really capable of taking everything from him? Was it possible to carry this guilt beyond death? I didn't know if I was going mad or if, finally, I was awakening to something greater. Something that came from the soul, not reason. Something that logic could never explain, but that my heart recognized. It was in this chasm between fear and fascination that the story truly began. And in that moment, I realized that the only way to understand my present was to face my past. It was one rainy afternoon that everything intensified. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard my son humming an old melody. The problem was I knew the song, a Hungarian folk song I'd heard only once, on an exchange trip when I was 19. He'd never heard it at home, much less in English. But he sang it with an accent, as if his tongue had memorized every syllable instinctively. the sound sent shivers down my spine. I walked slowly into the room, like someone entering an unknown temple. He was stacking books, saying he needed to build the tower to see the other side. I asked where that song came from, and he replied without hesitation. "It was our song before the war. You sang it when you were hiding from me." I couldn't say anything. I stood there, motionless, my soul in pieces. I returned to the kitchen, unsure of who I was. Dinner had burned. The rain outside seemed to be repeating the steps of a bygone era. The sound of drops hitting the glass drew me in, as if the universe were trying to tell me something. It was a portal, an access point to a story my mind couldn't remember, but my soul could. And once again, the word reincarnation flashed through my consciousness with brutal force. After that, I began writing down everything he said, every sentence, every strange look, every comment that belied his age. It was as if he'd accessed a memory bank I couldn't yet reach. He spoke of castles, inheritance disputes, a medallion hidden in a tree. Once he called me Ezra and said it was my old name. The worst part was that that name echoed within me with an inexplicable pain. One night, while he slept, I entered his room and watched. The lamplight cast shadows on his face, and for a second I didn't see a child there. I saw a man, a serious, ancient look. I could almost hear an ancient sigh leaving his lips. I felt a strange presence, as if we were sharing the same timeline, only scrambled. Fear mingled with fascination like poison and cure. The next day, he drew two identical boys, one with a sword and the other with a book. In the drawing, the one with the book was on fire. When I asked what it meant, he said, "It was when everything burned down, when you betrayed me out of jealousy and took the throne." It was a complete plot, a finished script. But he said it so naturally that my body no longer knew what was real. The drawing is still tucked away in the back of the drawer. I began to suffer from insomnia. I heard sounds that weren't there. I could smell wood, wax, and old metal as I entered the house. It was as if memories from other lives were embedded in the walls. My body began to respond with nausea, chills, and a strange sadness, as if mourning something I couldn't remember, losing. The cosmic plane seemed to want to wake me by force, and what had once been fear became urgency. I researched similar stories and found accounts of reincarnation among family members, especially siblings who return as children. It was more common than I thought. There were scientific records, testimonies, even books. I began to understand that this ancestral memory wasn't just his. It was mine too. We were connected by something that spanned generations, names, and even blood. I began to feel a different affection for him, a respect that went beyond motherhood. It was as if I were facing an equal, someone I had hurt and who, even so, chose to return through me. Silence held ancient secrets between us, and time was no longer a straight line. I began to accept that there was something greater at play. We were not alone. We were being guided. And then, on an ordinary afternoon, he made the revelation no one expected, one that would bring to light the darkness of who I was and the reason behind everything that kept repeating itself. "You stole my place, and then left me to die. Alone." That was what he said as he drew two side-by-side graves, one with a crown, the other with nothing. I looked at the scene and felt my chest sink. How could an 8-year-old carry such sadness? It was as if he were unearthing an entire cemetery in our living room. I tried to talk to a friend, tell her everything, vent. But she looked at me with pity and laughed. She said my son had a vivid imagination, that I needed to sleep better. When I mentioned the word reincarnation, she backed away, uncomfortable. I felt ridiculous, as if I'd made it all up. No one understood, and that only made me sink deeper into myself, where only silence could hear me. I avoided talking to my mother. She was too religious to accept that kind of thing. My son's father had been absent since I was pregnant. He never believed in anything beyond his own desires. So I was left alone, in a maze of memories that weren't mine and pain I couldn't quite place. Isolated inside my own home, with a child who spoke as if he had centuries of history in his eyes. At work, I started mistyping simple numbers, forgetting passwords, and missing meetings. My mind was so busy trying to piece together invisible pieces that the logic of everyday life became a burden. People asked me if I was sick, and I was. Sick of a past I didn't remember living. Time seemed to be watching me. The world, which once made sense, was now a poorly rehearsed theater where everyone pretended not to notice their soul screaming. I began to avoid contact with others. I would wake during the night with premonitions, muffled sounds, old names echoing in my dreams. One of them, in Leon, repeatedly. A figure always appeared in my nightmares, eyes like my son's, but angry. He called me a thief, a traitor, and he cursed me with words from a language I never learned, but understood. It was as if one part of me was being judged by another. The emotional weight intensified. I looked at my son, and for a few seconds, saw a stranger, a wounded man, a betrayed brother, and it frightened me. How could I continue to be the mother of someone who looked at me with centuries of hurt? Guilt began to grow within me. Even without proof, even without memories, something inside me told me it was true. My soul whispered it constantly, but part of me still resisted. I searched for rational explanations. Perhaps he'd seen a movie, read something secretly, overheard a conversation. But none of these hypotheses explained the details, the names, the feelings. It was as if everything came from a place outside of time. The word reincarnation kept coming back, ever more vivid, even as I tried to deny it. One night, I lay beside him as he slept. I gently touched his hand and silently asked him to forgive me, even though I didn't understand exactly why. I felt a wave of warmth wash over the room, a soft yet dense presence, as if someone were there with us. The air grew heavier. My tears fell uncontrollably, and I slept like that, embraced by a mystery that never stopped pulsing. The next day, he said, "I felt it when you apologized. It helped a little, but it still hurts." That broke my heart. How could I move on with this long-standing pain infiltrating the purest relationship of my life? How could I continue living without understanding what truly connected us? The unveiled purpose was still far away, but the journey had begun. That's when I decided that even without help, I needed to seek answers on my own, because he wasn't the only one who needed healing. I was too. That night, I sat with the old hardcover notebook where I recorded my son's words and all the dreams that haunted me. I began connecting the dots like a spiritual puzzle. The repetition of the name Leonan, the drawings of castles, the fire, the sibling feud. It was as if a tragic romance were being reenacted in my own home. But it wasn't fiction. It was something burning inside, as if my soul was crying out for justice. I decided to discreetly investigate the names my son mentioned. I searched for Ezra and Leonan, together and separately, in Old English, in historical archives. In a medieval genealogy forum, I found mention of two noble brothers from the 13th century, whose power struggles ended in tragedy. One died of poison. The other disappeared. The story was vague, but there were too many details that matched what he said. It felt like digging a dark well, and already hearing whispers at the bottom. I started visiting old bookstores. One day, in a small shop tucked away in the Candler Park neighborhood, I found a dusty book that discussed reincarnation and soul patterns that repeat themselves within families. The author cited cases in which former rivals were reborn as mother and son, trying to heal deep traumas. Blood was the new bond. Karma, the new lesson. I read this with trembling hands. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a cosmic plan trying to reveal itself. Each sentence pierced me as if it had been written for me. Those we have grievously hurt often return where forgiveness can be born, in the womb. My soul whispered that there was truth there, even when my mind refused to believe it. I returned home with the book pressed to my chest, like someone carrying a letter from destiny. My son looked at me when I walked in and said, "You came looking for us, didn't you?" That was more than a shock. It was the confirmation no one expected. I began to record my dreams more accurately. In one of them, I was being taken to trial by a council. Leonan watched me from afar, poisoned, pale. I cried, but no one heard me. The scene was silent, as if the entire universe were punishing me, with the echo of its own conscience. When I woke up, I wrote, "It wasn't about guilt, it was about learning." It was painful but liberating to recognize that, even without remembering, something inside me needed to change. I began to notice how my son reacted to certain of my actions. When I asserted myself too much, he would back away as if fearing orders. When I apologized, he would approach me affectionately. It was as if we were unwittingly rewriting a history of control and power. I, who in my past life had sought dominion, was now the mother of someone who demanded freedom and reparation. Reincarnation was no longer a theory. It was flesh, presence, connection. I sent an anonymous message to a local spiritual study group. I was invited to a discussion group about soul memories. I watched in silence as others shared similar stories. One woman said her current husband had been her tormentor in a past life. Another said her daughter was her former rival. No one looked at me like I was crazy. For the first time, I wasn't alone, and that made me breathe differently. I returned home with a newfound relief. For the first time, my heart didn't weigh so heavily. Perhaps because, amidst those stories, my pain gained context. The silence that had previously suffocated me now whispered paths. I didn't have all the answers, but I was listening. And my son, seeing me come in, ran to hug me. Without saying a word, he just rested his face on my shoulder and sighed. It was as if he too had felt the change. That night, I wrote in large letters at the top of my notebook, "We are here to repair, not to repeat." The phrase welled up from deep within me, like an ancient memory. I knew there would still be pain, fear, confusion. But I also knew something had changed within me. The path was no longer about escaping the truth, but about diving into it, courageously. Fear still existed, but now it walked alongside faith. And it was precisely in this moment of apparent peace that a new detail emerged. A name buried in my current past, capable of connecting everything in an unexpected and frightening way. After that night of silent revelations, I began to feel a constant presence around me, as if I were being watched by something that came from both within and without. It wasn't just spiritual, it was emotional, visceral. I could be surrounded by people and still feel like I was in a cave. The search for answers distanced me from others. It was as if talking about reincarnation put me on a frequency few knew how to hear. Returning to work felt like a punishment. Between numbers, spreadsheets, and goals, everything seemed trivial compared to the enormity of what I was experiencing. I tried to tell a close colleague, but as soon as I mentioned the name Leonan, she looked away. "You need a vacation, Hazel." She said it with a forced smile. And that's when I realized no one understood. The soul has its own labyrinths, and this journey I would have to make alone. The nights grew longer. The silence in the house weighed heavily. I heard Leonan's footsteps in the hallway, light, childlike, but inside me they sounded like the footsteps of a wounded man. I began writing letters I never sent. Letters to him, to myself, to what I had been. It was my way of emptying my chest and dealing with the guilt. I asked for forgiveness for things I couldn't remember, but felt had happened. The pain was old, but alive. Every time he smiled, a part of me felt relieved. But every time he looked at me seriously, as if he could see right through me, my heart sank. It was as if he knew more than he was saying. Sometimes he'd draw two, suns on the paper, one with long rays, the other dim. When I asked, he replied, "One is you now. The other was before, when you took away my light." That tore me apart, because even without remembering, it made sense. One night, I got a call from school. He'd pushed a classmate and said, "That's how my brother started." The teacher asked if he had any siblings. I said no, but inside everything screamed, "Yes, he does, and that sibling is you." The weight of carrying two roles, mother and something I couldn't name, made me sick inside. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was a soulful exhaustion, as if I were trying to patch together centuries with gestures from the present. I began to distance myself even further from people. I declined invitations, deleted social media, and avoided visits. I created a sort of emotional cocoon where only my son and I existed. But even so, there was an invisible barrier between us. How could I fully love someone who still blames me for a past I barely understand? Silence held secrets, but it also created chasms. Sometimes he cried alone. I listened from the doorway, unsure of how to enter. I even considered seeking spiritual help, but something inside me told me this journey was ours. Not because there were no guides, but because part of the purpose unveiled was experienced in silence, eye to eye, gesture by gesture. And then I realized reincarnation wasn't a story to understand. It was a path to travel, and like every path, it would have rocks, shadows, and perhaps redemption. I started leaving notes around the house. Little phrases like, "You are loved. There is no blame here. I'm trying." He read them and didn't respond, but he kept them all. I found one on his pillow, carefully folded. It said, "I'm trying." Maybe it wasn't enough, but it was a start. A ray of light among so many memories blurred by time. His soul seemed to be listening, and that gave me the strength to carry on. On a cloudy afternoon, he brought me a different drawing. It wasn't two brothers anymore. It was a tree with intertwined branches. This is us. No one climbs anymore, but the roots embrace. This made me cry in front of him for the first time. He hugged me without saying anything. In that embrace, there was a pause in the pain. A moment without karma, without weight, without judgment. It was just love. And that's when I felt, for the first time, that perhaps there was room for healing. But just as I began to believe this, a new memory emerged, and what it held was darker than I had imagined. It all started with a smell. A woody, ancient perfume that filled the house on a windless Sunday. We were alone. My son was playing on the living room floor when he suddenly stopped, as if the air had grown heavy. "He's here," he said without looking at me. "Who?" I asked, my throat dry. "You? The way you were before?" I felt my stomach tighten. My soul whispered that something was about to emerge. That same night, I dreamed of a stone room lit by torches. I, or someone I was, wore dark, heavy clothes. Before me, Leonan knelt, weeping. I held a scroll and said, "You were never worthy." There was an echo. There was anger, there was envy. I woke with the feeling of having committed a crime. The pillow was wet with sweat and tears. It was more than a dream. It was a memory. I wrote everything down. The tone of his voice, the look in his eyes, the coldness in his words, the sense of power and fear. And I wrote, almost without thinking, that was the beginning. In that life, I wanted everything that was his. The respect, the prestige, the love of the people. He was loved too much. I felt invisible. And so, slowly, I became a shadow. Until one day, my envy turned into action. I betrayed him. I denounced him for something he didn't do. And I watched it all fall apart. The next day, my son woke up with a fever. He was delirious, speaking in another language. "Ezra, why?" he repeated. I called the doctor, but there was no infection, no inflammation, no apparent cause. It was as if his body was processing what his soul remembered. I stayed by his side all night, and at some point he looked me in the eye and said, "Now you remember. I felt it." I cried right there, without a shield. The revelation no one expected had been confirmed. Reincarnation was no longer a theory. It was flesh and pain. My body recognized his words as if they were bullets rewinding. I had done it. I, Hazel, had been Ezra, and Leonin, the brother I loved and despised at the same time. It was a twisted love, shaped by rivalry and despair. And now he was here, before me, as a son, asking for what I never knew how to offer: reparation. In the following days, between fevers and silences, I began to reconstruct that story in my mind. I saw flashes of the trial, of the poison hidden in a cup, of his gaze as he fell to the ground. My heart tightened with a nameless guilt. It wasn't about guilt. It was about learning. I wrote in my journal, trying to transform the pain into a path. But it wasn't easy. Every memory was a dagger that pierced me silently. He got better. He started playing again. But now he looked at me differently. There was a strange wisdom in his eyes, as if the child had receded and an older spirit had taken over. "You can try again, Mom. But you have to be real this time." Those words haunted me all day. I didn't know where to begin. How do you redeem yourself from something that transcends centuries? Where do you learn to love someone who has already destroyed themselves? I returned to that old book and reread a passage. The past only disappears when faced with a naked heart. It's not about forgetting. It's about transforming. The pages spoke to me like a letter written by my own soul. I decided that, from then on, every gesture I made with Leonon would be a conscious choice. Not to erase what had happened, but to give it new meaning. Because now, the ancestral memory was awakened. One afternoon, as we walked in a park, he took my hand and said, "Can you protect me now?" There was no pain in the question, only hope. I responded with a yes that came from deep within, a yes that was older than my current name. A yes that wanted to rebuild the broken bond between two spirits. And in that moment, I felt history changing. For the first time, he trusted me. But trust is fragile when ghosts still haunt. And I knew, before healing, fear would still come. In the days that followed, peace seemed possible. The dreams diminished, the drawings changed tone. But it was precisely in this calm that the dilemma began to take shape. I knew what I had done in that past life. I knew that the bond between Leonon and me was marked by pain, by an envy that surpassed the limits of the soul. But I also knew that now, as a mother, my role was different. And that frightened me more than anything. I began to feel afraid of making another mistake, afraid of repeating the pattern without realizing it. Was I suffocating him? Was my zeal disguised guilt? Was my desire to make amends robbing him of the space to grow freely? With each gesture of affection, an inner voice arose. Are you trying to erase the past or truly love? My soul whispered, care, but don't control. And I no longer knew what was right. One afternoon, he locked himself in his room and said he no longer wanted to talk about what he remembered. Forget it, Mom. If we're going to heal, it has to be in silence. That disarmed me. Part of me wanted answers, wanted to apologize 100 times, to hug him until it all went away. But I realized that my need for redemption was, once again, about me, not about him. And perhaps unintentionally, I was repeating the same movement as before, taking his space out of fear of losing him. The dilemma was real. How to find the balance between repairing and suffocating, between loving and releasing. It was like walking a tightrope between two lives, trying not to make the same mistakes. Reincarnation brought us face to face again, but it didn't give us a manual for reconciliation. It only offered us the setting. The plot was now our choice. And that hurt, because it forced me to grow like never before. I spoke with a woman from the spiritual group I visited. She said, sometimes the greatest request for forgiveness is the silence that respects the other person's time. This phrase turned me inside out. My impulse was to speak, explain, justify. But now the purpose revealed seemed to be different. To trust. Not in human time, but in the time of the soul. Because learning often happens when we stop trying to teach. I began observing him from afar, without intruding. He began expressing himself through art. Clay sculptures, abstract paintings, cardboard characters. Each creation seemed to speak of something he no longer wanted to express with words. I saw 2 animals in a recent drawing, a wounded fox and an eagle with its wings outstretched. "That's us," he said. "She attacked me, but now she watches me from afar, and I'm learning to fly." That made me tremble. I went to the bathroom and cried, softly so he wouldn't hear. It wasn't sadness. It was a mixture of humility and astonishment. Because in that moment, I realized he didn't need me to heal. He just needed me not to stop him from healing. It was painful, but liberating. Reincarnation brought us together. Again, but true love demanded that I no longer be the protagonist of his pain. I left a note on his bedside table. "When you're ready, I'll be here. And if I never am, that's fine too." He didn't respond. But the next day, he placed an origami star next to my breakfast. It was enough. A small gesture that said, "I see you." And for the first time, I felt the past no longer dominate us. It was being integrated, step by step, without haste. In the mirror, I began to see myself differently. I no longer saw just the tired woman, full of doubts. I began to see the soul behind the flesh, a soul that had erred, that had been hurt, but now chose to do differently. Love, when it's mature, doesn't shout, it waits. And I learned this from him. But just when I thought the dilemma was resolved, a new figure entered our lives, someone who carried another piece of this spiritual puzzle. It was at a school assembly. A new student had arrived and the parents were being introduced. When I laid eyes on that man, something inside me stopped. It was like déjà vu, but deeper. His face was familiar, but not from the recent past. It was as if my soul recognized him before my mind did. When our eyes met, I felt a chill, and saw, for a second, the eyes of someone who had judged me centuries ago. He introduced himself as Adrian. Tall, calm, with a gentle manner that hid something. Leonin, upon seeing him, froze. He said nothing, but his eyes shone as if he'd just seen a ghost. On the way home, he said, "He was there. When you condemned me, he was the counselor." Silence held secrets so ancient that time could no longer explain them, and yet another piece fell from the sky, as if part of a cosmic plan. Little by little, Adrian grew closer. He was helpful, polite, always willing to help. We began exchanging messages about the children, schoolwork, and projects. But inside, something within me recoiled. I dreamed of him watching me fall from the tower, whispering advice to the king. I saw his face amid torches and blood. I screamed, and he said, "It was your choice." It was impossible to deny. We were reuniting. Another karmic connection was emerging. I asked Leonin if he wanted to distance himself from him. He hesitated. "I think we need to know what he's going to do this time." That dismantled me. It was as if Leonin were more mature than I, facing the past with the courage I lacked. Reincarnation brought everyone back. The traitor, the victim, and the accomplice. But now, the pieces were jumbled, and no one was anymore just what they had been. We invited Adrian for coffee, like parents of schoolmates. I feigned normalcy, but my heart was racing. When he walked in, the energy shifted. Leonin was quiet, serious. And Adrian, looking at him, paled. "You look like someone I met in a story I never lived." The sentence tumbled out uncontrollably. Silence. No one knew how to react. But there, unintentionally, he touched a nerve, and all three of us knew it. That night, Leonin came to me and said, "He's trapped in the past too, but now you're the one who can set him free." It was a heavy burden. How could I offer forgiveness to someone who once reinforced my downfall? How could I know if he also remembered or just felt it? Forgiveness isn't asked for, it's built. And perhaps our reunion was more of an invitation to learn than a reopening of judgment. Meetings with Adrian became frequent. Sometimes we talked about old books, other times about lives that seemed already lived. He spoke with a curious melancholy. "I feel like I'm fixing something, but I don't know what." The soul whispered through him, and I sensed that perhaps he was listening too, even if he didn't fully understand. There was no revenge between us, only questions. Leonin instinctively began to play with Adrian's son, as if this new bond were part of the healing. As if, by bringing the children together, the cycle became less burdensome. Adrian's eyes began to change. The hardness gave way to a care I hadn't expected. Sometimes he seemed to look at me with sadness, other times with relief, as if, finally, he was allowing the present to breathe. And I, even though I was afraid, let it happen. I let the new approach. I let the past unfold slowly. Because perhaps loving again, trusting again, was the only way to heal what was left hanging in that life. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be rewritten. And I began to understand that. It wasn't about guilt, it was about learning. But before the healing was complete, the universe still had one challenge in store, and it would come from the depths of fear. The following days were marked by a tension I couldn't name. It was as if something invisible was being pushed to the surface against my will. Leonin began to have fits of rage. He screamed, cried, and refused to sleep alone. At night, he said, he dreamed of bars, accusing voices, and the pain of being forgotten. "You left me trapped there," he repeated, his eyes red. I hugged him but felt like nothing was enough. I began to feel flawed, powerless. We were so close to a possible cure, but everything regressed. I wondered, had I touched the past too soon? Or did part of our karma demand that, before we could free ourselves, we relive the pain once more? Reincarnation, contrary to what I imagined, wasn't just about reunion, it was also about exposure. Exposing the shadow to finally transform. Leonin began to reject me at times. He said he didn't trust me. "It's like before, you look at me the same way." It tore me apart. Even though I loved him with all my being today, he still saw behind his mother, the brother who betrayed him. And this made me feel trapped in two times, trying to be good in the present while paying off debts from the past. It was emotional torment, as if we were going in circles. Adrian, sensing my distress, offered to talk to Leonin. "Maybe he needs to hear another voice," he said, and I allowed it. During that conversation, the two of them were locked in the room for over an hour. I don't know what was said. All I know is that when they left, Leonin looked at me with watery eyes. He remembers, not everything, but he feels, and he said he'll try to do things differently too. That gave me hope. But the pain hadn't gone away. Ancestral memory is like an underground river. Sometimes it overflows without warning. And so it was. One morning, I woke up screaming. Leonin was in the hallway crying, saying that the castle was falling. He was shaking so hard I thought he would faint. I hugged him tightly and, in a whisper, asked for forgiveness. For the 1,000th time. He rested his forehead against mine and said, "You need to forgive yourself too." It was a boy saying it, but it sounded like an ancient angel. The next day, I wrote this sentence in my journal. Forgiveness doesn't just come from the other. It begins within. It was true. I could no longer live as an eternal debtor. I needed to embrace what I was, and from there, decide who I wanted to be. My soul whispered that this was the final crossing, the point between being a victim and being the author of a new story. But crossing required pain, courage, faith, and a lot of patience. The biggest challenge was realizing that love alone didn't solve everything. It required presence, repetition, listening, and humility. I began to meditate silently while he slept. I visualized light between our souls. I asked my invisible guides for strength. Sometimes I felt the presence of something warm around me, like invisible arms enfolding me. Maybe it was just hope, or maybe it was Leonin from before, slowly forgiving. At work, my energy plummeted. I took a leave of absence. I isolated myself for a few days. I didn't want to see anyone. It was like an internal winter. But in this seclusion, I began to see something blossom. Amidst tears and silence, I realized we weren't failing. We were making it through. And this journey, however dark, was part of the unveiled purpose. The soul doesn't come to be distracted. It comes to remember. Leonin smiled again after one of those silent nights. He brought me a drawing of 3 figures holding hands. Now there's balance, Mom. But there's still healing to be done. That moved me. He knew. He felt. He lived. The challenge wasn't over yet, but we were stronger, more aware. And that was half the healing. But little did we know that just ahead, an even greater revelation awaited us, one that would change everything, again. It was on a silent late afternoon, with the sky tinged with golden hues, that everything changed. We were sitting in the backyard, Leonin drawing in silence while I watered the plants. The sound of the water hitting the earth brought me peace, until he said, "Mom, I did bad things in that life too. I pushed you to become what you became." Time stood still. My hands trembled. My soul whispered that, once again, the truth was coming. I turned slowly and sat beside him. "What do you mean, son?" I asked. He looked me in the eye, fearlessly, and said, "I was cruel to you before. I laughed at your mistakes. I made jokes. I belittled you. I thought I was better. And I liked seeing you suffer. You lost yourself, because I pushed you." My heart pounded. It was the revelation no one expected. For the first time, he admitted there were shadows in his story too. In that moment, something opened between us. It was as if a thick layer of judgment and guilt had been peeled away. We were both victims and perpetrators, siblings at odds, soulmates who didn't know how to love each other at the right time. Silence held secrets, yes, but now it was beginning to set them free. And in this exchange of truths, I saw in him the man he was and the boy who tried to be better. Reincarnation didn't bring us together to repeat, but to reframe. In that moment, I felt as if 1,000 lifetimes were being healed simply by admitting, together, that we'd made mistakes. And that was when the great turning point began. He placed the drawing in my lap, a bridge made of broken stones, held together with threads of light. This is us now, hurt, but trying. I stared at the paper like someone reading a sacred map. For the first time, there was no longer victim or villain. There was shared pain, mature love, and the courage to move forward with open eyes. I understood that it wasn't about erasing the past, but rather integrating it. It was painful, but liberating. And there, in the purity of any given evening, I knew healing would not come from unilateral forgiveness. It would come from honesty between souls. We then decided to create our own ritual, something simple, just ours. We wrote on a piece of paper everything we wanted to leave behind: envy, pride, fear, resentment. We put it in a box and buried it at the foot of the tree in the backyard. Leonin said, "Now it's with the earth, and the earth knows how to transform." Her words echoed within me with the power of an ancient mantra. It was the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. In the days that followed, the changes were subtle but profound. Leonin slept better. I smiled more. Conversations became lighter. Fear receded, and trust began to grow between us. The present, finally, was no longer hostage to the past. Our purpose was clearer. We had returned to remember that love demands truth, and that no relationship survives without humility. Adrian appeared shortly afterward with a gift, an old book on spiritual reconciliation. "I felt I should give you this," he said, his eyes welling up. He didn't know the details, but perhaps his soul did. I thanked him silently. It was another link being healed, even without words. The cosmic plan was unfolding gently. Everything that had seemed like chaos now made sense. Leonin hugged me before going to sleep that night. She said, "Now we can truly be mother and son, right?" I answered with all my heart, "Yes, my love." For the first time, whole. And deep down, something calmed, as if the inner sky were at peace. But the universe still had one last adjustment in store, a final lesson about the legacy all this would leave on our lives. After our bridge was rebuilt, something changed in me forever. It wasn't a visible change, the kind someone praises or comments on. It was internal, deep, almost invisible, as if the cells of my soul had been rearranged. The pain was still there, yes. But it no longer controlled me. It no longer dictated my actions, my fears, my reactions. It was as if I had finally understood that the past wasn't a punishment, but an invitation to mature, to love differently, to stop running away. And this learning became the greatest legacy of my life. I began to talk less and listen more, to judge less and understand more. I realized that, even in the most difficult relationships, there is a hidden wisdom that we don't always understand in the heat of pain. Reincarnation showed me this, that each reunion is a piece of ourselves crying out for attention. Leonin became lighter. The nightmares almost completely ceased. When they returned, he knew how to cope, breathe, draw, count. His pain didn't disappear, but it transformed into language. And so did I. I was no longer the mother desperate for forgiveness. I was a woman learning to love without the burden of saving anyone, to love just for the sake of loving. And that perhaps was the highest point of healing. The greatest proof of this was when he said, "Mom, you can stop trying to prove to me that you've changed. I already know." That broke me. But at the same time, it freed me. I understood that sometimes we insist so much on repairing that we forget to live. That true, constant, honest presence is worth more than any repeated excuse. And that's how I began to live differently. Without fear, without guilt, with presence. Adrian naturally moved away. He moved to another city with his son, but he left a letter. "Thank you for allowing this story to be different. It was beautiful. Sad too, but necessary. Some souls come only for the final adjustment, and they leave in peace." I cried with the letter in my hands, but it wasn't the same crying anymore. It was the kind of tear that cleanses, not weighs. The silence was no longer empty. It was rest. I started writing again, no longer in secret diaries, but in texts I shared with other mothers. I spoke about soul ties, reincarnation, the weight and lightness of loving someone who has hurt us. I received messages in return. Many. Some from women who also felt guilt without knowing where it came from. Others from people who dreamed of lives they seemed to have never lived. And there, I realized that my legacy extended beyond me. I began to teach Leonin about choices, that he doesn't have to repeat anyone else's story, that he can make mistakes, but he also has every right to change, to love, to forgive, to remake himself as many times as he wants. The past teaches, but doesn't define, I would say, and he listened with that look of someone who carries centuries in their chest, but also carries hope. Because now, the cycle no longer needed to revolve in pain. Looking back was no longer a punishment. It was a mirror that showed us what we were so we could decide what we would be. My ancestral memory still lived within me, but now it was a source of wisdom, not burden. My soul had scars, yes, but each one told a story that, in the end, brought me here. And that was enough. One day, as I watched Leonin sleep, I whispered, "Thank you for coming back. Even though you were hurt, even though you were angry. Thank you for giving me this chance." He didn't hear, but I knew his soul was listening, because now we were clean, whole, and all that was left was to move forward. But before moving on, there was one more scene, one moment, that would align everything we had experienced up until that point: mind, body, and spirit. That morning, everything seemed ordinary. The sound of birds, the sun streaming through the curtains, Leonin still curled up in bed. But there was a strange stillness in the air, as if time had paused. Something inside me told me that this day would bring more than routine. There was a strange vibration, an invisible expectation. My soul was whispering, "Today, everything will fall into place." As I prepared coffee, I saw Leonin appear in the doorway, his eyes brimming with tears. He wasn't crying, but he looked as if he had been. In his hands was a folded letter, written in his childish handwriting. "I dreamed of everything," he said, sitting at the table. Not as pieces, but as a whole movie. My body froze. I knew what was coming wasn't just a dream. It was a spiritual journey. He took a deep breath and began to tell me. He said he was in a dark castle surrounded by mirrors. In each mirror he saw a version of himself, child, old man, warrior, betrayed. But in the center of the room was a chair, and I, or the old me, was sitting in it. You didn't see me, you only saw your pain. That struck me like a lightning bolt. It summed it all up. I had been blinded by my own wound. As he narrated, I saw everything with the eyes of my soul. Images appeared in flashes, the cold stone corridors, the pain in Leonin's old gaze, the arrogance in my own gestures. But in the end, the chair turned to ash, he said, and we saw each other for the first time. It was then that I understood. That scene was no ordinary memory. It was a coming together, a symbolic full stop, a rite of passage. I cried, but not out of guilt nor sadness. It was an ancient cry, carrying centuries of pain and understanding. You looked at me and said, "I exist." The sentence dismantled me. It wasn't about justifying anything, nor apologizing 1,000 times. It was about acknowledging the other in their pain, their truth, their wholeness. It was about what I'd never done in that life. And now, finally, I was doing it. I took the letter from his hands. He had written, "Today, the burden ends." What comes next is a choice. I kept it as a testament to my soul. It was the most powerful sentence I could ever read, coming from the child whose brother I had once been. The past was healed not with explanations, but with gestures, with presence, with love, with listening. And we had arrived. That day we went for a walk in the woods near our home. The light filtered through the trees like a sacred veil. He ran ahead of me, laughing, and for the first time, his laughter didn't carry guilt. It carried lightness. It was as if time had given us a new chance to exist, not as what we were, but as what we choose to be now. Mother and son. Whole. We sat by a stream. He threw pebbles and talked about simple things. School, friends, desires. And I listened as if it were all poetry, because after so much darkness, simplicity becomes a miracle. The ancestral memory was still there. Yes. But now it was memory, not prison. It was a compass, not shackles. And that made all the difference. Adrian reappeared that same afternoon. He came to retrieve an object he'd forgotten long ago. When he saw Leonin, he knelt and said, "You have the most sincere eyes I've ever seen." Leonin embraced him, and I realized that even between souls that have caused pain, respect can be born. Even love, even from afar. It was a seed planted in another time, finally sprouting. Later, I wrote it all down in my notebook. The soul knows how to wait. The soul does not forget. But the soul also knows how to heal. I wrote with steady hands, as if signing a pact. And in that pact, I committed to a new life. Not of perfection, but of truth, of listening, of lightness, of presence. Because the spirit doesn't want answers, it wants coherence. Night fell with a warm wind and a clear sky. Leonin called me into the bedroom. He wanted to sleep holding my hand. "Just to remind you we're together, okay?" I lay down beside him, and for the first time in a long time, I slept soundly. No dreams, no alarms, no fear. Just a peaceful silence. Like someone who'd finally arrived home. I dreamed of a blue flame. A flame that didn't burn. It just illuminated. And I felt it was Leonin's soul, touching me, welcoming me. The cosmic plan had completed a stage, and I was awake, whole, free, and deeply grateful. Nothing else mattered beyond that. But even with all this, the past still awaited its final farewell. The moment to close the cycle with reverence and truth. It was on a rainy afternoon that we decided to visit the small rural town where my grandmother was born. Nothing had been planned. Leonin had asked, saying he wanted to see where the roots began. That intrigued me. He'd never heard of the place, and yet he spoke as if he already knew it. We set off on the road without much of a destination, with a feeling that something important awaited us ahead. The town was simple, almost forgotten in time. Cobblestone streets, old houses, trees that seemed to carry stories. When we got out of the car, Leonin fell silent. He looked around as if reliving something. Here was where it all ended. I shivered. It didn't make sense. We'd never been there. But something inside me also recognized the ground. We walked to the central square where an old church stood with its doors ajar. We entered slowly. The smell of old wood and melted candles enveloped us. Inside, a painting caught our attention. Two brothers facing each other, separated by a line of fire. Leonin stopped before the image and said, "That was us. Before the fire, before the end." The soul whispered, and we listened. I sat on the bench and let the tears come, because in that moment I understood. That city, that place, was one of the ends of the story. Perhaps not literally, but symbolically. It was the final scene of the previous incarnation, the stage where the bond was broken. And now we returned not to relive it, but to close, to end with reverence what had bound us for so long. Leonin lit a candle on the altar. He said nothing. He just knelt and remained silent. I knelt beside him. I closed my eyes and asked forgiveness from the universe, from the earth, from myself, for taking so long to listen. But I also gave thanks for having returned, for having chosen to find each other again, even in pain, even in fear, because it took courage to start over. As we left the church, an elderly woman watched us. She approached slowly and said, "Your energy is ancient. You've reached out before, right?" I smiled, unsure of what to say, but she continued, "Forgiveness has come. Now it's just a matter of planting the new." Those words struck me like a blessing. It was a revelation no one expected, coming from someone who barely knew us. Leonin hugged her spontaneously. Then he ran to the square and twirled around with his arms open, as if to say, "Now I'm free." I watched him with teary eyes. There was my son, my brother, my mirror. And for the first time, he didn't carry the weight of what we had been. He was just himself, whole, alive, light, and I was beginning to be too. We drove home in silence, but it was a good silence, full of meaning. It was as if we were listening to the final score of a movie, a song without lyrics, made only of feeling. I drove with one hand, and with the other I held Leonin's. Time was no longer our enemy. It was now our ally. The road ahead was new, even though the tires were treading on old asphalt. At home, we burned the last page of the diary I'd kept since the beginning. It was a symbolic gesture, not to erase, but to release. Because everything that needed to be said was already said. Everything that needed to be felt was already inside. Silence no longer held secrets. It held wisdom. It was time to move on, without weight, without guilt, with lightness and respect for what had passed. Leonin drew two interlocking circles. Now we are here. No longer separated by swords or bonfires, but connected by what we have learned. Reincarnation had completed its cycle. It brought what needed to be brought. It showed what needed to be seen. And now it could rest. Not to be forgotten, but to be honored. The soul does not erase. It transforms. Days later, I dreamed of a field of flowers. I walked hand in hand with a child and a man. It was Leonin and I in previous versions. We were smiling, at peace. The sky was lilac, and the wind spoke a language I didn't understand, but felt. It was the language of the soul. the language that only speaks when everything aligns. I woke up at peace, completely at peace. Life went on, with its routines, its challenges, its small joys. But nothing was the same, because now we knew where we came from. And more importantly, we knew where we were going. Connections were honored, bonds were remade, and ghosts were finally embraced. Karma dissolved. Love remained. And that was all. But with the end of the old cycle, something new was born. The chance to live a life free of unconscious pacts. And finally, to choose. Reincarnation taught me that time is a gift. That loving isn't about controlling. That forgiving isn't about forgetting, but choosing to see things with new eyes. And that true newness isn't born outside. It's born within, with presence, with awareness, with courage. That's what I learned alongside my son, from my brother, from the soul that taught me more than any book. I wrote on my wall in small but bold letters, "We are not what we have done. We are what we choose to be now." This phrase guided me through the difficult days, because yes, they would still come, but I was no longer that woman who hid from the pain. I now danced with it, and carried on. With faith, with lucidity, with an awakened heart. Leonin asked me for a new journal. I want to start writing my own story now. But the right way, from the beginning. I smiled. I handed him the notebook and said, "Write with your soul, son. It never lies." And I saw in his eyes a priceless freedom. The gift was his, whole, free, chosen. It was the greatest gift I could give. And so we continued without promises, without ready-made maps, only with the certainty that what was beginning now didn't need to be a repeat of what had passed, because we had already done the hardest part, crossing the darkness and coming out alive on the other side. But before the end, there was still one last choice to be made, and it would define everything that came after. It was on an ordinary weekend that I realized the time had come to close the cycle completely, not with pain, nor with urgency, but with awareness. We were well, stable, light, but something inside me told me there was still one last choice to be made, a spiritual, intimate choice, invisible to the eye. And I knew. It was my turn to decide who I would be from now on. Leonin was playing in the backyard when I called him. "I want to show you a place." He agreed without question. We got in the car and drove to an open field far from the city, where only the wind could be heard. It was where I used to go when I was young, when I needed to think. I took a small wooden box with me. Inside were letters, objects, and symbols that have accompanied me since the beginning of this journey. We dug together with our hands. We placed the box deep in the earth and sprinkled dried lavender petals on top. "This is to calm the weather," he said. We carefully closed the hole. There was no sadness. There was honor. It was a silent ritual of closure, a pact with the present. There, we let go of what no longer needed to be with us. Not through denial, but through transmutation. We lay there staring at the sky. The sun filtered through the clouds, casting shadows across our faces. "Mom, what are you going to do now that it's all over?" he asked. The question was simple, yet profound. And in that moment, I realized nothing was over. Just the same old cycle. Life, it was just beginning. I took a deep breath before answering. "I'm going to live. That's all. Really live." Before going to sleep, I sat in bed and wrote, "The greatest proof that we have evolved is that we now know how to let go." And I did. I let go of fear. I let go of guilt. I let go of the obsession with fixing everything. The final choice was this: to trust. In time, in love, in what would come. To trust that the soul knows. It always has. And that, if we listen with our hearts, we will never be lost. And if you've made it this far, perhaps you're also experiencing your own healing cycle. If you felt something within yourself, share it with me in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because the soul, when awakened, wants only one thing: to continue.